are in the library of the old Olinger Foy home at the corner of Broadway and Grant Streets here in Meyersdale. And my name is Jennifer Hurl. I'm the Meyersdale Public Library's archivist, and I want to share with you some stories about the Olinger family's time here in the home. They would have lived here from the time of the home's construction in 1869, finished in 70 by the father John M. Olinger, up until the passing of the final Olinger to pass here in Meyersdale in 1954. So the Olinger family called this place home for about 85 years. And in researching this house and the Olingers, we came to discover some really neat stories about the family, and especially the women in the family. They loved to open the home to their friends and family members and community members. They did a lot of entertaining within these walls. For example, we found a note in the Old Republican newspaper in 1900. Mary, Kate, and Emma, who were all daughters of John and Sarah Olinger, they entertained the Brethren Sunday school classes here in the home. Mary was actually one of the Sunday school teachers at the time in the Brethren Church. In 1910, you'll notice we have some red geraniums placed throughout the home, and there's a reason for that here today as we're doing these tours in August of 2023. In 1910, Kate hosts a party with a red color scheme, and each of the guests, along with her name card, received a red carnation, and then they had a geranium hunt. And they placed geraniums in spots in the house and left little clues as to where to find the geraniums. And the Republican story notes how the girls ran through the house from cellar to attic trying to find the geraniums and had a wonderful time doing so. Unbounded hilarity, the newspaper noted, was the time they had on their geranium hunt. And each guest, upon leaving, received a potted geranium. Another thing we learned about the Olingers is that they loved to travel. In 1903, we found reference to Mary and her husband, Harry. He was a cook. Harry was a jeweler here in town and a watchmaker. And Harry Cook, he became Mary's husband, and they spent a lot of time with Emma and Kate, Mary's sisters. All four of them traveled in February of 1903 on a long trip excursion to St. Augustine, Florida. Another interesting party we found note of in the Republic and here in the Olinger home was held in 1911 in May of that year, and Kate and Emma hosted 10 of their girlfriends here in the home for a Dutch luncheon, they called it. And everything was on the Dutch order, as the newspaper reported. The centerpiece was a huge head of cabbage flanked by radishes and onions. The place cards were decorated with little fat Dutch dogs, and the guests even left with a little pair of wooden shoes as a souvenir. There was an exclusively Dutch menu, with the piece de resistance being a plate of sauerkraut and wienerwursts. And Kate, who was the youngest Olinger daughter, even read a Pennsylvania Dutch story for entertainment. The entire affair passed off very pleasantly, according to the Republican. In 1916, probably the most entertaining story we found about the Olingers and their parties here happened in 1916, and it was an April Fool's party. And I'll just read a little bit of the story that appeared in the Republic in that year. It was titled April 1st Evening. Mrs. Emma and Kate Olinger entertained last Friday with an April 1st evening. The first thing to greet the eyes of the guests was the following sign upon the door: "No one home at this door." Whereupon they found their way to the east door, only to be confronted with the sign, "Follow the road." The road took a circuitous route to the rear of the house and finally led to the west kitchen door. Here the guests were met by the hostesses, who were gowned in costumes typifying the event. The gentlemen were directed to the cellar to remove their wraps, while the ladies ascended a rear stairway for their wrap rooms. Each guest, upon entering the living room, was asked to register, a feat that but few could accomplish, as the lead would suddenly disappear from the pencil. A musical program followed, in which Maurice Clark won the laurel wreath for his mastery of the double bass, a wooden snow shovel with various colored strings and a meat saw to serve as a bow. After the program, the guests were bidden to supper. To be seated at the table was quite a feat, as the chairs had a habit of disappearing under the table just as one was about to be seated. After a struggle on the part of each one to land firmly upon his chair, each reached for his napkin, only to find that it stuck tenaciously to the tablecloth. At each plate was a very unique place card and a fork and spoon of prehistoric patterns. Among the menu items that evening here in the home were sugar plums, tapioca pudding, blue points on the half shell, Hamburg steak, and fried filet of sole. So the Olingers ate very well that evening and seemed to have a grand time in the process. It sounds like a wonderful party, in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, the Olingers like to travel. And in 1917, there's note in the Republican of Sarah, the mother, and her daughters purchasing a fine new Hudson Super 6 sedan car in Pittsburgh and driving it home that spring. In 1919, the Olinger girls hosted a wedding gown reception here in the home, and it was billed as one of the most unique and delightful social affairs which has been given in Meyersdale in quite some time. And what they did is displayed wedding gowns representing styles from 1859 up until 1912. Emma Olinger, along with 4 of the other women present, served as models for those wedding gowns. And the newspaper noted that the 50 guests who were present enjoyed fully the strange vagaries of fashion of the years gone by, contrasting them with the equally strange ones of the present age. Again, in 1921, we found note of Sarah and her daughters returning from a trip to Petersburg, Florida that May, and they note that the home was being reopened as it had been closed for the winter. I couldn't find any confirmation of the Olingers owning any property in Florida, although I didn't really have the chance to dig deeply into that, but it seemed like they quite often would head south for the winters and close up the home here. One year they even took a trip to California over the winter months. And their chauffeur was a man named Alan Miller. He was from the community just south of here of Springs. And an interesting note about Alan, he lived here with the Olingers. The first I could find evidence of him living here was in 1920. He's here in the home with the Olinger family in the 1920 census. And he resided here up until the time of his death in 1948. He passed away in the Hazel McGilvery Hospital, which was located up on Main Street here in town, but his funeral was held here in the Olinger home. And the best I could discern from my research in preparing for today was that he was very close. I don't think he was just simply a chauffeur. He was a close friend of the family, because I also found stories where even some of his siblings would take trips with the Olingers. Now, Sarah, the mother, would live here until her passing in 1922. She actually passed away in the Hillsview Sanitarium in Washington, PA. She had been spending about 3 weeks there trying to recuperate from her poor health, but she took a turn for the worse and passed away there. Her daughter, Mary, was at her side at the time of her death, and her body was also brought here home to the family home where the funeral was held. The newspaper noted that at the request of Sarah's family, flowers were omitted, and the funeral ceremonies were short and simple, in accordance with Mother Olinger's lifelong habit of avoiding all semblance of ostentation. It was noted that Sarah had many devoted friends among the community's young and old alike, and she donated to innumerable charities. She never failed to help her church or town. She was broad-minded, well-read, as we stand here in the family's library, and she didn't seek recognition or public praise for any of the laudable things she did. After Sarah's passing, Emma and Kate, her daughters, and Mary continued on. They would still host some parties here in the home. I found an interesting story in 1925 where Emma and Kate hosted a kitchen shower for Frances Livingood and her fiance, J.E. Imler. And Frances, some of you may know, is actually known as the mother of our library. She was president of the Women's Club in the late 1930s, and they were the ones who spearheaded the formation of Meyersdale's Free Public Library, today the Meyersdale Public Library. So Frances was here in the home with the Olinger women, her friends. Emma, Kate, and Alan, the chauffeur, traveled in 1926 by automobile all the way to California, to San Diego specifically, and they didn't return until April 1927, so they spent that winter in California on the West Coast. And cute little story, in 1931, Kate is preparing to serve as a judge for Meyersdale's Christmas light contest. And apparently the year before, they had quite the display here around the Olinger home. It was noted as being an elaborate and artistic display here on the Olinger property in Christmas of 1930. Kate and Alan in 1926 traveled along with two of his sisters to the nation's sesquicentennial celebration in Philadelphia. So the Olingers enjoyed hosting here in the home, and they enjoyed traveling outside of its walls. Emma Olinger, another sister who spent her entire life in this home, would pass away on the 6th of November, 1937, at midnight here in the home. She was only a few days shy of the age of 65. And it seemed, in my research, I discovered she struggled with some heart issues throughout the course of her life. But as I mentioned, she spent her entire life here in these walls of the old Olinger home. Late 1939, after Emma's passing, Kate is hosting a women's club meeting here at the home. And she exhibited some quilts of rare beauty, and on the agenda for that meeting was a report by the library committee on how the library was progressing. And the library would open that same year, 1939, and here we are in 2023, and we're still going strong. Mary's husband, Harry, I mentioned him earlier, Harry Cook, he was another popular fellow around town. He passed in August of 1940, ironically on the morning of he and Mary's 41st wedding anniversary. They had taken a little trip for their anniversary to Romney, West Virginia, and he passed away while on that trip. And Harry seemed like a really popular guy around town. He was song leader of the Rotary Club. He was referred to in the Republican story about his death as being an apostle of good cheer. His body was laid to rest with simple ceremony, no pomp nor music, which I found ironic, being he was the Rotary's song leader. And it was noted that to be cordial, kind, and considerate was his constant habit. Gloom was banished from his thoughts. His funeral, too, held here in the Olinger home. And he and Mary had one adopted daughter, Sally. Again, I didn't have time to dig into the details regarding Sally and her entrance into the Olinger family, but I do know that about her. Harry was a violinist, and at one point, the article noted, he was a member of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They also pointed out that his wife, Mary Olinger Cook, was the one who taught him to sing and helped him become an accomplished tenor and alto singer. There was a substantial amount of talent in the Olinger Cook families in the way of musical abilities. And to top it off, Harry was also a licensed optometrist. John, the family's surviving son after the passing of Frank in childhood, John and Anna ended up in Kansas. And John would enter business in Kansas with Anna's husband, Cyrus Beachy. They briefly entered the banking business, and later they became major owners in an ice and ice cream business out there. John would pass away in Kansas, spending most of his adult life there in 1943. And he too was noted as being very modest throughout his life. And it was his wish that he be cremated and his ashes brought back here to Meyersdale. So you will find a little stone for the son, John Olinger, up in the Olinger family plot up in Union Cemetery, and his ashes were interred there. His wife Maud would go on to live to be 100 years old, and she was laid to rest in Kansas. So Kate lived on here in the home, and she continued hosting meetings of the Women's Club, the Brethren's Home Missionary Society. In April of 1946, there's a meeting here in the home where reports are given on library progress, and Marguerite Copley was present at that meeting. Anyone who's familiar with our library knows Marguerite Copley was a beloved librarian and genealogist historian. She's a major reason our Pennsylvania room at the library exists. So she was present here at a meeting in the home. Now finally, Kate, the youngest daughter, would pass in 1951. She had battled a long illness, and as I dug into her and her story, I learned that she passed away of cancer. And her death certificate notes that in 1943, she had a cancerous lump removed from her breast. So she lived, she lived for a while after being diagnosed with cancer for a number of years. And she finally succumbed to the illness, and she passed away too in well, no, she didn't. She was in Hazel McGilvery Hospital for a number of weeks, and she asked near the end that she be brought back home to pass away. And she did pass away here inside the home. Her funeral service was held here. And Kate, she had one sister here in Meyersdale remaining, Mary Olinger Cook. And in Kate's will, she bequeathed what was left of the Olinger estate, including this home, to the Meyersdale Community Hospital, which was being constructed at the time of Kate's passing. The hospital would open a year after her passing in 1952, but she did note in her will that Mary would be permitted, of course, to reside here until her death. And finally, 3 years later, in September of 1954, Mary would pass away here inside the home. She had a helpmate, a nurse here present with her, and she simply passed away in her sleep at age 84. The article related to her passing notes that all her life she took an active interest in community affairs and contributed generously to civic enterprises. She helped many a family out of financial and personal difficulties, and many of her gifts were made anonymously. And I found the same noted after Kate's passing 3 years prior to Mary's. There was a little clip in the Republican about how she didn't seek credit for her gifts. She gave a lot to the community around her, but she often just did so anonymously, would give donations to places like the library, simply noting from a friend. So the Olingers, for all their wealth and ability to build a home of this status, really, I learned they were at heart very humble. They liked to entertain, they liked to welcome people into the home, but they didn't seek so much credit for the things they did to build Meyersdale and surrounding communities.